Today we're talking about a recent report by the National Resources Defense Council about which states have the best flood disclosure laws, which ones have the worst. Are you protected when you buy a property? That's what we're talking about in today's video. Hello, my name is Chris Green, president and owner of the Flood Insurance Guru. Today we are talking about flood insurance property disclosure laws. We're talking about the good states, we're talking about the bad states. Some of these bad states will shock you. So when we're talking about property disclosure laws here, what we're talking about are states where things have to be disclosed, like what flood zone are you in? Are you in flood zone X? Remember, this is what's called minimum risk flood zones. Flood insurance is generally not going to be required here unless potentially you've taken out a disaster assistance claim. They call them low risk, but remember, 30% of flood claims still come in this area. Then you've got flood zone A. Really, if it begins with A, AE, there can be a lot of different numbers here, AO. These all fall within the 100-year flood area. These are the highest risk areas outside of the coast. Then we've got V. These are going to be your coastal flooding areas. Once again, this is in your 100-year flood zone. So when you're looking at these property disclosure laws in these states, one of the things they have to disclose is, of course, what flood zone is the property in. Then they generally have to disclose, has the property ever flooded? Then you've got some states now that are saying, hey, you have to actually disclose what is the flood risk. How close to water are you? Like Texas, who a couple years ago passed probably one of the strictest property disclosure laws after so many floods on properties were covered up after Hurricane Harvey. And a lot of people were buying properties and they had no idea they had flooded. So let's get down to the meat and the potatoes here. Let's talk about these good states. You know, as of 2021 and now going into 2022, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Oklahoma, these states still consistently rank in the top 5 for the best states for property disclosure laws. So if you're buying a property in these states and it's in a high-risk flood zone, it's in a low-risk flood zone, have the confidence that the laws are in place to help protect you for a reason. You've got a lot of flooding that happens in these areas. Let's just look at Texas. We're talking about not just Hurricane Harvey, but multiple hurricanes. We're talking about widespread flooding that happens in Houston on a yearly basis. In Dallas, you had one of the worst flash flood events that happened overnight just over a year ago, where several inches of rain were received overnight in an area that doesn't usually get that much. Widespread flooding happened, causing major flood damage. Oklahoma, let's look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, several years ago. Another widespread flood event on the Arkansas River that caused widespread flooding. You had casinos that were shut down for 6 months at a time. Louisiana, historically a big flood area because of hurricanes. Traditionally, a lot of Louisiana sits below what's called the base flood elevation. New Orleans is almost like a bowl where it sits below, so it doesn't take much here to flood because it's so flat. Mississippi, same way because of the coastal exposure there. We saw what happened in Jackson, Mississippi a few years ago that caused widespread flooding across the state. See, it doesn't have to be coastal. Well, we're starting to see a lot of severe weather pattern changes, and that's why you're starting to see a lot of these property disclosure laws change. Recently, New York, New Jersey, and South Carolina all made big changes to their property disclosure laws after they had received failing grades in years past about the way that things were disclosed. Now, this is big for South Carolina. One reason is a lot more flooding has been happening in areas like Myrtle Beach over the last couple of years with some of these hurricanes coming in. New Jersey and New York historically have had flood problems, not just from Hurricane Sandy, but you had other hurricanes that have come through that had dropped large amounts of rain. Just recently, New York had received 7 inches of rain in less than 24 hours, causing widespread flooding in Brooklyn. Now, someone else who may soon pass a property disclosure law that is very strict is North Carolina. Once again, a coastal exposed area with Wilmington. But not just Wilmington. If you move inland, you look at what Hurricane Michael and Florence did many years ago where they caused a lot of inland flooding, where large amounts of rain in a short amount of time that a lot of these states are starting to see our residents are at risk here. We need to make sure they understand what is the flood insurance cost, what is the actual flood risk. Remember, flood risk and flood zones are different. Flood zones are used more from a regulatory standpoint. A flood risk, or hey, what are the actual chances of this property flooding? You can actually find our flood risk assessment tool down in the description or in the comments, where you can actually find out what the flood risk on your property is from 0 to 100. How close to water are you? What's the average premium for flood insurance here? Now let's talk about some states that actually don't have property disclosure laws at all as this video is being shot. And these are going to shock you. Georgia, Alabama, Florida. All these states where hurricanes are a major issue actually do not have property disclosure laws when it comes to flood. This is alarming, especially in Florida. As you've seen things with Hurricane Ian, let's look at Naples and Fort Myers, about all these properties that were devastated, that were completely rebuilt. There's no property disclosure law on the flood side to protect homebuyers in these situations. So you really got to ask questions when you're looking at buying properties in these areas. In Florida, you may want to ask, hey, has a property ever flooded since you've owned it? Has a property ever flooded since you've lived in it? That way, if it's an investor or if it's someone who was a primary residence, you've got that covered either way. Recently we saw this happen in Alabama. Customer doesn't ask these questions. They go to buy the property. Property floods a few months after they buy it. Come to find out, the property had flooded 6 times before they bought it, but it wasn't disclosed because the questions weren't asked here. And this was in Alabama, which is one of these states that does not have property disclosure laws on flood. Georgia's another one. Let's look back at the flooding that happened in Atlanta back in 2009. The widespread flooding in Cobb County, Marietta. A lot of these properties were bought back by FEMA. A lot of these properties weren't bought back by FEMA. People would go to buy them, but there was no disclosure law on the flood side that said that it had to disclose that it had flooded. You see, so you're starting to see this happen a lot. That's why it's so important to ask these questions. But with this National Resources Defense Council report, giving a lot of these states failing grades, some of these states upgrading, especially areas like New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, potentially North Carolina, we're starting to see this a lot in these coastal states that have these problems. But as a property owner, as a potential property owner, you want to make sure you're asking the right questions. That's why down in the description, you can also find our guide to property disclosures based on each state. On our website, you can actually find links to the disclosure laws for every single state across the country that we shot several years ago for this exact reason. So in today's video, we want to talk about the good states, the bad states, these property disclosure laws, this article from the National Resources Defense Council, and what it means for you as a property owner. So, if you want to learn more about these property disclosure laws, questions you need to ask when purchasing a property, you can click up here in the corner and it'll take you to one of our next videos that shows you that. You can also check down in the description for guides and resources that we have available for you. My name is Chris Green, president and owner of the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for tuning in to today's video on flood disclosure law states, the good, the bad, the ugly.